In 1356, at the height of the Black Death, Cairo completed the Sultan Hassan Mosque, the largest and most ambitious religious structure of its era. The plague had just reduced Europe's population by a third, yet here was a civilization pouring resources into a project that would take decades and cost enormous wealth. This challenges our instinct that disaster stops progress. Understanding why societies build bigger after crisis changes how we think about recovery and resilience. And Cairo was not alone. Across the medieval world, from the temples of Angkor to the cathedrals of Europe, similar patterns appear, civilizations constructing on a grander scale in the wake of massive loss. It forces a deeper question. What forces drive this impulse to build after devastation? And are there times when it does not happen? The answer begins in the streets of 14th century Cairo. In the 1340s, Cairo lost roughly a third of its population to the Black Death. Trade stalled, tax revenues collapsed, and the remnants of the previous dynasty's authority crumbled. By every normal measure, this was the worst possible time to begin a mega-project. Yet in 1356, Sultan Hassan ordered construction to start on what would become the Madrasa and Mosque of Sultan Hassan, a complex that still dominates the city's skyline. Its dimensions were staggering for the era. The central courtyard measured 80 meters long, the main entrance rose 38 meters high, and the dome, long since collapsed, was among the largest ever attempted. Compared to any major building from the decades before the plague, nothing approached its scale. The motivation went beyond vanity. The Mamluks had taken power only a century earlier and faced constant threats from rivals and invaders. The crisis had deepened those fractures. By building something permanent and enormous, Hassan asserted that the Mamluk state had not only survived but would dominate the future. There was also a religious calculus. After a catastrophe many saw as divine punishment, a monumental house of worship served as atonement and a plea for protection. Crucially, the population loss had an unexpected side effect. Displaced peasants flooded the city seeking work, making labor cheaper, and property prices fell, freeing revenue for the crown. The Mamluks did not build despite the crisis. They built because of it, using its aftermath to consolidate power and reinvent the city. But Cairo was not an isolated case. Half a world away, the Khmer Empire faced a similar crisis in the late 12th century. In 1177, a Cham fleet sailed up the Mekong River, caught the capital Angkor off guard, and sacked the city. Temples were looted, the royal palace burned, and the king perished. For the Khmer, this was an existential shock that shattered centuries of dominance. Prince Jayavarman had fled during the invasion. When he returned to drive out the Cham, he inherited a devastated kingdom. Instead of simply restoring what had been lost, he launched the most ambitious building campaign in Khmer history. In the decades after 1177, he transformed Angkor into a fortified city of unprecedented scale. He built Angkor Thom, a walled capital 5 kilometers on each side, surrounded by a wide moat. At its center rose the Bayon, a temple covered in massive stone faces. He also constructed over 100 hospitals, rest houses along every major road, and reservoirs that expanded the irrigation system. Jayavarman had converted to Mahayana Buddhism and saw his projects as acts of religious merit meant to protect the realm, but the political need was just as urgent. The invasion had shown that the old elite could not defend the kingdom. By building on a scale that dwarfed every previous king, Jayavarman asserted that the new order was stronger and would not be broken again. The building campaign also served as an economic stimulus, absorbing displaced workers, creating trade routes, and projecting control over the countryside. Where the Cham had come to destroy, Jayavarman built to remake the entire civilization. Angkor's greatest architectural period was not a product of peace and prosperity. It was a direct response to the empire's worst crisis. The logistics that made these projects possible were already in place before the crisis struck. In Cairo, the Sultan Hassan Mosque required enormous stone from the Muqattam hills. The Nile carried blocks downstream, and oxen hauled them from the riverbank to the site. The Mamluk state had a well-established corvée system that required peasants and artisans to contribute days each year to public works. After the plague reduced the population, the Sultan could redirect that labor more easily because fewer competing projects and fields demanded it. The mosque was completed in just over 7 years, a speed that amazed contemporary observers. At Angkor, the logistical advantage was built into the landscape. Centuries of canal and reservoir construction created a ready supply chain. Laterite was quarried near the canals, and the same waterways that carried water to rice fields now transported building materials to the capital. Local governors mobilized workers from their provinces, many of them displaced by the war. The Bayonne and Angkor Thom rose within about 30 years. This was not a desperate gamble. It relied on existing infrastructure and a state apparatus capable of mobilizing resources efficiently. The crisis did not create these capabilities. It redirected them. Across Europe after the Black Death, the same redirection of resources emerged, but the motivations became distinctly religious and competitive. Between 1348 and 1350, the plague devastated roughly a third of the population. Yet within a generation, many of the continent's most ambitious cathedrals saw work accelerate. In Prague, Emperor Charles Roman IV pushed forward St. Vitus Cathedral, expanding its scale to rival France's great churches. In England, the Bishop of Winchester ordered a grand new nave, larger than what had stood before. Across Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, cities raced to rebuild or enlarge their main churches, often with plans that would have seemed impossibly ambitious before the disaster. The economic logic mirrored Cairo's. Fewer people meant fewer crops, fewer wars, and fewer competing demands for labor and materials. Stone, timber, and land became cheaper. Wages for skilled masons rose, but rulers and bishops could still commandeer labor through feudal obligations and church tithes. The strongest driver, however, was religious. Many communities saw the plague as divine punishment. A grander cathedral was both penance and a plea for protection. Town chronicles record vows made during the worst of the epidemic. If the city was spared further devastation, the people would raise a church more magnificent than any before. Civic competition added fuel. Cities that had long rivaled each other now saw rebuilding as a chance to outdo neighbors. A taller spire, a wider nave, a more elaborate facade proved the community had survived and still possessed the power to build. That competition intensified after the plague. Across Europe, wherever a society survived disaster and still held the institutions and belief that building mattered, it built on an unprecedented scale. But this pattern was not limited to societies recovering from plague or invasion. It also applied to the civilization that did the conquering. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire. The city was devastated, depopulated, and largely in ruins. A conventional expectation might be that the conquerors would simply occupy what remained and gradually patch things up. Instead, Mehmed immediately launched a building campaign larger than anything the city had seen in centuries. Within a decade, the massive Fatih Mosque complex rose on the site of the former Church of the Holy Apostles. It included a mosque, a hospital, schools, a library, a bathhouse, and a market. New fortifications were added, aqueducts were repaired and extended. Neighborhoods were planned and settled with relocated populations from other Ottoman territories. The scale of construction was not modest. It was deliberately grand, meant to transform the conquered city into a worthy capital of an expanding empire. What crisis drove this? For the Byzantines, obviously, the crisis was absolute. But for the Ottomans, the crisis was one of legitimacy. Mehmed had taken the city, but ruling it required more than military victory. He needed to erase the old order and imprint a new identity on the landscape. He needed to demonstrate that Ottoman rule was permanent, powerful, and divinely approved. The building boom was his answer. This complicates the picture of crisis. It was not only natural disaster or invasion that triggered monumental building. A political rupture, a change of leadership, a need to prove stability after chaos could produce the same impulse. In this case, the builders were not recovering from disaster but creating a new reality from the rubble of an old one. And they did it on a scale that made the crisis itself seem like a starting point rather than an end. But this pattern was not universal. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Crusaders took Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire fractured into several competing states. No single authority could command labor or tax surplus on a large scale. Monumental building stopped. Compare that to Cairo after the plague or Angkor after invasion. There, centralized states channeled recovery. The Mamluk Sultanate held enough power to launch new construction, and the Khmer kings rebuilt after being pushed back. The difference was not the crisis itself, but the presence of a strong central authority able to coordinate resources and enforce projects. In Europe after the Black Death, some regions saw ambitious cathedrals completed, but many stalled. Siena had begun an enormous cathedral expansion before the plague. When the population dropped by more than half, the city-state's government was too weakened by loss and internal division to continue. The expansion was abandoned. Unfinished walls still stand as a reminder that without a strong leader who could push through the project despite devastation, crisis leads to collapse, not construction. The critical condition is centralized political authority capable of mobilizing labor, gathering tax revenue, and overriding local opposition. Without it, crisis deepens divisions and depletes already scarce resources. So central power appears essential, but that observation raises a deeper question. Why are those who hold this power so motivated to build after crisis rather than simply restore what was lost? Centralized power provides the practical capacity to act. After the Black Death, Sultan Hassan commanded one of the most efficient administrative machines in the medieval world. The Mamluk state had a sophisticated tax system that could extract surplus from agriculture and trade even with a reduced population, and a corvée system that conscripted peasants and prisoners for public works. When the plague struck, the state redirected these mechanisms. The same bureaucracy that collected grain taxes shifted to quarrying stone and transporting it to Cairo. The result was the Sultan Hassan Mosque, completed in 7 years, a remarkable pace even before the crisis. The same pattern appears in Angkor. After the Cham invasion in 1177, King Jayavarman VII inherited a state that had managed water, labor, and harvests across the Tonle Sap basin for centuries. The Khmer Empire already had canals and reservoirs for agriculture and transport. When Jayavarman launched his building campaign, he used that infrastructure to move laterite and sandstone from distant quarries and drew on a population accustomed to large-scale organization. The result was Angkor Thom, the Bayon, and hundreds of other structures built within decades. In contrast, the Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade saw its central administration fragment. Tax collection collapsed. No single ruler could command the labor of a dispersed population. Without that machinery, even the desire to rebuild the capital remained a wish. But capacity alone does not determine whether rebuilding happens on a grand scale. Economic conditions also play a crucial role. The economic landscape after a crisis shifts in ways that can make monumental building cheaper. When a plague or invasion reduces the population dramatically, the supply of labor drops and wages for skilled workers often rise. Yet in many medieval contexts, the surplus of displaced peasants and refugees created a large pool of unskilled labor that rulers could mobilize through corvée obligations or direct conscription. The cost per worker might have been low because many displaced people had few other options for survival. Meanwhile, land and building materials became abundant. Abandoned farms meant quarries and forests were easier to access. Timber from deserted villages and stone from ruined buildings all suddenly became available at little cost. After the Great Plague in Europe, the price of building stone in some regions fell by as much as half. The same disaster that devastated communities also concentrated resources in the hands of the state or the church. Rulers who could command these resources found themselves with a rare advantage: cheap materials and a captive labor force. Building on a grand scale became economically rational, not just symbolic. It stimulated demand, provided employment, and absorbed the displaced into productive work. In Cairo, the Mamluk Sultan's massive project employed thousands of workers who might otherwise have been a source of unrest. Angkor's temple-building campaigns likewise channeled surplus labor into infrastructure that sustained the kingdom's recovery. The practical consequence is clear. A devastating crisis does not automatically destroy the economy. It reshuffles it, and for a ruler with the right machinery, that reshuffling can turn disaster into an opportunity to build bigger than before. The economic logic of building after a crisis was powerful, but it only explains how rulers could build, not why they did. To understand that, we must enter the medieval mind, where every disaster carried a divine message. When the Black Death swept through Europe or the Cham invaders attacked Angkor, people did not ask what economic reshuffling had occurred. They asked what they had done to anger the gods. The most visible answer was to build something enormous, proving the community remained faithful and worthy of protection. Sultan Hassan's Mosque in Cairo was not just a political statement. Its foundation inscription frames the project as an act of gratitude and supplication, a plea for mercy after the plague. King Jayavarman VII converted to Mahayana Buddhism after the Cham invasion and built Angkor Thom as a cosmic mandala, a sacred city to restore the kingdom's spiritual balance. In Europe, cathedrals rose with similar logic. The plague was interpreted as divine punishment for sin. Building a grander cathedral was both penance and a bid for heaven's favor. Religious institutions themselves were often the most stable entities after a crisis. They held land, accumulated treasure, and maintained administrative continuity when secular rulers were weakened or absent. The Catholic Church funded cathedral projects across Europe even as local lords struggled. In Cairo, the Mamluk Sultan personally funded the mosque, but its endowment came from the state treasury, staffed by religious scholars who saw the project as a sacred duty. Faith did not just motivate construction, it provided the moral framework that made massive expenditure acceptable to a traumatized population. People asked why a ruler would spend on monuments when so many were afflicted. The answer was that the monument itself was a response to the crisis, a declaration that the community was not abandoned, that order would return. Religion gave building after crisis its meaning, and meaning made the sacrifice bearable. Meaning alone does not explain the scale. Competition forced it upward. Among the Mamluk sultans of Cairo, each ruler knew his mosque had to surpass the one before. Sultan Hassan raised the highest minaret and largest dome of its time, but his successors aimed further. The Mosque of Al-Muwayyad, built after another wave of plague, included a grand double portal that directly referenced the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, a deliberate claim to superior sacred prestige. These men were not merely thanking God. They were sending a message to rivals and every noble and merchant that the new ruler was stronger, wealthier, and more favored by heaven than the one he replaced. The same dynamic unfolded in Europe. After the Black Death emptied towns and shook trust in traditional authority, surviving cities turned on each other in a quiet war of stone. Ulm, a free imperial city in Germany, began its cathedral in the late 1300s with an ambition for a single spire nearly 530 feet tall. Not because the population needed that size, the plague had devastated the city. Ulm wanted to outshine the cathedral of nearby Strasbourg and every rival in the region. In France, the builders of Beauvais Cathedral attempted the highest vault in Christendom, an engineering gamble that led to collapses. The logic was clear: beauty and scale became proof of divine favor and civic strength. A city that could erect a monument taller than its neighbor was a city that had not been broken by the crisis. Competition did not just accompany recovery. It channeled the collective drive of a reeling population into a race for greatness, and it often made the buildings even larger than the crisis alone would have demanded. Competition drove the scale, but it was not the root cause. After a crisis, the old order is shattered. People have seen institutions fail. The natural question arises: why should I obey this ruler? Without an answer, authority dissolves. A massive building provides a convincing answer. It demonstrates that the ruler has the resources to command thousands of workers and mountains of stone, the organizational power to coordinate a years-long project, and the favor of heaven. It says, I can provide order. Look at what I am building. This is proof that I have not lost control. That is why every major driver, economics, religion, competition, ultimately serves this single need. Cheap labor and materials make the project possible but do not make it necessary. Religious conviction provides motivation but is channeled through the ruler's need to show he has restored divine favor. Competition accelerates the scale but only works if the ruler can already claim authority to initiate the project. Consider Sultan Hassan in Cairo after the Black Death. The plague had devastated the city and the Mamluk Sultanate was in flux. Hassan built his mosque to project unchallengeable authority. Its monumental scale and prominent location were calculated to announce that his rule was secure, and the mosque became a symbol that the Mamluk state had weathered the storm. Think of Jayavarman VII after the Cham invasion of Angkor. The Khmer Empire had been humiliated, the capital sacked, the king died, the population scattered. Jayavarman did not just build one temple. He built an entire new capital city with roads, hospitals, and reservoirs on a scale that dwarfed anything previous. Every structure was a statement of restored order. The massive faces on the Bayon temple were not just the face of a god, they were the face of the king watching over his rebuilt realm. Now look at the counterexample. When the Byzantine Empire fragmented after the Fourth Crusade, no single ruler had the central authority to command a major building project. The result was not just a lack of monuments, it was a collapse of legitimacy. The empire never truly recovered. The absence of grand building was both a symptom and a cause of declining authority. This insight turns our understanding of crisis and construction on its head, but it raises a critical question. Were such projects actually successful in the long run, or did they sometimes deepen the very crises they were meant to solve? But the monument was not just a statement. It had real consequences for the people who lived around it. The Sultan Hassan Mosque was built with a madrasa attached, a school that attracted students from across the Islamic world. That meant scholars, scribes, merchants. The mosque complex became a commercial anchor. Shops opened around its gates. Trade routes shifted to pass through the neighborhood. Within a generation, Cairo's economy had not just recovered but diversified. The building did not just symbolize resilience, it actively created the conditions for it. At Angkor, the benefits were even more direct. Jayavarman VII did not build only temples. He built a network of hospitals along the empire's main roads. Inscriptions record that each hospital had a staff, a stable budget, and a set of trained physicians. That system did not exist before the crisis. It was born from the same post-invasion building campaign that produced the Bayon. A traveler crossing the Khmer Empire after the reconstruction would have found not only grand stone faces but also functioning medical care, rest stops, and reservoirs that kept the rice fields irrigated. The building boom did more than impress visitors. It bound the kingdom together with actual infrastructure. Even in Europe, the great post-plague cathedrals had a practical side. Construction projects lasted decades and sometimes centuries. They employed masons, carpenters, roofers, scaffolders, and the quarrymen and timber harvesters who supplied them. That steady demand for labor absorbed displaced populations, especially peasants who had lost their villages to the plague. A man who might have starved in a ruined hamlet instead spent a decade cutting stone for a cathedral spire. The wages were not high, but they were reliable. The building itself became an economic engine that helped a shattered society find its footing again. These projects were not vanity, they were investments, and in the best cases they did exactly what the builders hoped. They turned a moment of collapse into a foundation for growth. But not every civilization that built bigger after crisis achieved that outcome. Some built bigger and still collapsed. But that impulse to build bigger after crisis did not vanish with the medieval world. After the Second World War flattened dozens of European cities, several chose not just to rebuild but to rebuild on a grander scale. Rotterdam rose from its rubble with a completely redesigned city center, wider streets, modern buildings, and a port that eventually grew into the largest in the world. Warsaw reconstructed its old town with such meticulous ambition that it earned a UNESCO World Heritage listing, the old town that had been systematically reduced to rubble. In both cases, the destruction became an opportunity to realize plans that had been impossible before. The same pattern appeared after natural catastrophes. The 1906 earthquake and fire that consumed much of San Francisco did not produce a smaller city. The rebuilding campaign that followed raised the skyline, straightened streets, and installed a modern water system designed to prevent a repeat of the fire. The city used the crisis as a chance to build something more durable and more impressive. But modern reconstruction is not a pure replay of the medieval pattern. Insurance companies, building codes, and economic calculations often constrain how big or how fast a city can rebuild. Yet the underlying driver, the need to demonstrate control, to restore confidence, and to signal that the future will be better than the past, remains powerful. When we look at cities recovering from hurricanes, earthquakes, or war today, we are still watching the same calculus play out. The question is whether the modern world still needs stone monuments to prove its resilience, or whether we have found other ways to show that crisis does not define us. Perhaps the real question is not whether we need stone monuments, but how we define resilience. The civilizations we have examined did not bounce back. They reinvented themselves. Cairo after the plague did not rebuild the same streets. Sultan Hassan commissioned a mosque that dwarfed everything before it, changing the skyline permanently. Angkor after the Cham invasion did not restore the old capital. Jayavarman Roman VII built an entirely new city, Angkor Thom, with the Bayon Temple at its center. European cities after plague replaced their cathedrals with larger, taller structures that embodied new confidence. The Ottomans did not restore Constantinople to its Byzantine form. They transformed it into a thriving Islamic capital with grand mosques and public buildings. In every case, the response was not recovery in the sense of restoration. It was transformation. These societies used crisis as a catalyst to become something different, often bigger, often more ambitious. The buildings were not just replacements. They were statements of a new beginning. What we call resilience in these cases is not a return to stability. It is a willingness to let go of the past and build something unprecedented. This challenges our modern approach to disaster recovery, which often aims to restore exactly what was lost. True resilience may require reinvention, not repair. But not all civilizations successfully transformed. Some built bigger and still collapsed later. the Khmer Empire built Angkor, an entire fortified city with a temple at its heart that still draws awe. But within a few generations, the empire began a slow decline. Environmental strain from intensive water management, changing trade routes, and internal instability eroded what Jayavarman VII had rebuilt. The monuments remained, but the power that raised them faded. Building bigger had not prevented collapse. It had only postponed it or perhaps masked the deeper fractures. The Roman Empire offers a parallel. After the crisis of the 3rd century, when invasion, civil war, and plague nearly tore the state apart, the emperors responded with massive construction. The Aurelian walls encircled Rome with a circuit 11 miles long. Diocletian built a fortified palace at Split, a miniature city of stone. These were not cathedrals or mosques. They were military and administrative monuments, statements of renewed control. For a time they worked. The empire stabilized, but those walls could not halt the long corrosion of institutions. A century later, the Western Empire fragmented. The buildings survived, but the civilization that built them did not. Post-crisis building can be an act of strength or a gamble that drains resources needed for more sustainable recovery. The crucial variable is not the size of the monument. It is whether the building is part of a genuine reconstruction of the society's foundations, or merely a spectacular gesture that consumes energy without addressing the underlying weakness. That distinction changes everything. The distinction between a genuine reconstruction and a spectacular gesture comes down to 3 conditions that must align simultaneously. First, centralized authority able to mobilize resources on a massive scale. A ruler or institution that can levy taxes, commandeer labor, direct supply chains, and enforce its will across a territory. Without that, crisis leads to fragmentation, not construction. The Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade lacked this. The fragmented city-states of northern Italy after the plague built on a smaller scale, never matching Cairo or Angkor. Second, the crisis must create a legitimacy deficit the ruler needs to fill, combined with an economic opportunity. The old order is destroyed. People question why they should obey. Building something permanent and grand is the most visible answer possible. It declares control, divine favor, and stability. At the same time, crisis often makes labor and materials cheaper. Land values drop, skilled craftsmen are available. Large projects become more feasible, not less. Third, there must be a cultural framework that values monumental construction as an expression of power and meaning. This can be religious, as when a sultan builds a mosque to thank God for survival, or competitive, as when rival cities race to raise the tallest spire. In medieval Europe, cathedral building was a contest between towns, each striving for the highest nave. Without such cultural pressure, rulers might choose other forms of recovery like tax cuts or military expansion. But in the medieval world, building big was how you proved you were back. When these 3 conditions align, building bigger after crisis becomes an almost inevitable response. It solves the legitimacy problem, uses available resources productively, and satisfies the cultural demand for visible prestige. This explains the successes from Cairo to Angkor. It also explains the failures. When any condition was missing, the result was stagnation or collapse. The Western Roman Empire after the 3rd century had the authority and the cultural framework, but the economic opportunity was increasingly hollow. Its building projects masked deeper decay. When all 3 conditions are present, the building becomes part of a genuine reconstruction that reinforces society's foundations. When one is missing, it risks becoming a spectacular gesture that drains energy without addressing the underlying weakness. So the real reason is not one driver but a convergence. Crisis creates the need, authority provides the means, culture shapes the form, and when those overlap, the monuments rise as part of real rebuilding. Crisis does not stop building. It can trigger the most ambitious projects when power, economy, and culture converge. the pattern holds true from ancient Egypt to Angkor. When authority provides the means, economic opportunity channels the resources, and a shared cultural framework shapes the form, devastation becomes a foundation for reinvention. The greatest monuments are not built in times of stability, but in times of transformation, when societies must reinvent themselves to survive. Crisis shatters the old order, but it also clears the ground for something new. The stones that rose after plague, invasion, and collapse were not mere repairs. They were declarations that the story was not over. They forced a choice: rebuild bigger or fade, and that choice gave civilizations the confidence to move forward, turning trauma into a turning point. The next time you walk past an old cathedral or mosque or temple, consider what drove its builders to reach so high. Can you think of a modern example, a city or country that undertook a major construction project right after a disaster? What do you think their motivation was? Share in the comments, and if you enjoy seeing history in a new light, subscribe for more deep dives that challenge conventional wisdom and uncover the patterns that shape our world. Each video will make you see the past and the present differently.